Yo, what's going on guys, Cultimush back at it with a $450 gaming PC build. I think this is a fantastic entry-level build, and usually for that $450 budget, I wouldn't come up with a build that can play games at 1080p really smoothly at really great settings, but this PC will do a pretty good job on the latest games at 1080p. With a lot of the prices dropping on CPUs and GPUs, for a $450 budget, you can actually do pretty well. Now, this PC is slightly over $450. If you use the mail-in rebates, you can get it for around $455, and if you opt not to use the mail-in rebates, it'll be around $480. Obviously, if you guys look hard enough, find some sales, you can probably get this PC for well under $450, but right now, as of recording this video, around $455 after the mail-in rebates. So without further ado, let's get right into this with this CPU. For the CPU of this build, I went with the AMD FX 6300 3.5GHz 6-core processor. A lot of you guys might be wondering why I didn't go the Intel route. The Intel Core i3 is like $130. And with it being a dual-core CPU, I know it does have hyper-threading, but being $130, that's not really worth it, and an i5 4460 is like $175, and in a $450 budget, you really can't fit that in. So in my opinion, the next best option is the AMD FX 6300. It's a 3.5GHz CPU, and while it isn't a world beater by any means, for a $94 price tag, you really can't expect that. But even in all of the latest games, the FX 6300 still does pretty well in them. The Mirror's Edge Catalyst system requirements just came out, and the FX 6300 is still the minimum requirement for that game. And the fact that a CPU this old for this low of a price can still run the modern games pretty well as long as it's paired with a decent video card, that's a pretty amazing thing, and I think the FX 6300 is a really good option for you budget builders out there. Moving on to the motherboard, I went with the Asus M5A97LE R20 ATX AM3 Plus motherboard. You can pick this motherboard up for $57 after a $10 mail-in rebate, which is a really great price for a full-size motherboard. It's got 4 RAM slots up to DDR3 2133 up to 32GB of max memory. You won't be able to go for an SLI configuration on this motherboard, but that's not really a big deal at this kind of a budget. And this motherboard has 6 SATA 6GB/s ports, so a really good motherboard for a very cheap price. And that's what you really want out of a motherboard in a super budget build. It's only $57, so it's super cheap, but it's still got all of the features that you need. Moving on to memory, I went with G.Skill Ripjaws X Series 8GB, 2 4GB sticks running at DDR3 1600MHz for $33. 8GB of RAM is so freaking cheap, and it's the optimal amount to go for in a lot of builds. Even in the latest games, 8GB of RAM does just fine. I have a PC worth well over $450, it's probably worth around $900 to $1,000, and I still run 8GB of RAM because it's just so freaking good. You don't need more than that if you're just looking to game. Sure, there are a few games here and there that do recommend 16GB of RAM, but even for those games, in my experience, having 8GB didn't hinder my experience at all. Next up, we got the hard drive, a Western Digital Caviar Blue 1TB. Just a 1TB hard drive in this build. Obviously, no SSD. You really can't fit that in this budget. If you're the kind of person where you can get by with only 120 or 240GB of space, then you can opt out of the hard drive entirely and just get an SSD. But I think for most of you guys, you're gonna need the storage space of the Caviar Blue. Obviously, if you have the extra cash, the best option is to get an SSD and a hard drive, but at this kind of a budget, usually that's not going to happen. So I think for most of you, just pick up the Caviar Blue. I have one myself. It's been working great for the last 4 years, and for the price, you really can't go wrong. Moving on to the video card, I went with the EVGA GeForce GTX 960 4GB Superclocked GPU. This video card is $190 right now, and there's a $20 mail-in rebate knocking it down to $170. And right now, GTX 960s are being bundled in with codes for Rise of the Tomb Raider. That's a game that even if you don't want to play it, you can easily sell that game for around $25 to $30 and recoup some of the cost for your GPU. So if you decide to use the mail-in rebate and sell off Tomb Raider, you can end up getting the GTX 960 for only $145, which is a ridiculously good deal. I should also mention that you can pick up XFX R9 384GB models for the same price, but those GPUs come bundled in with a copy of Ashes of the Singularity, which I don't think is as attractive of a game as Rise of the Tomb Raider, but hey, you might think differently. The GTX 960 does a really good job at 1080p gaming. It won't max out every game, but you can play games like The Witcher 3, Metal Gear Solid 5, Just Cause 3 at 1080p and around high settings and get 45 to 55 frames per second, which is very playable. If you do want to max out some of the higher end games, then you're going to be dipping to around 30 frames per second, which, you know, isn't the ideal experience when you're gaming on a PC. But regardless, the GTX 960 is a very good option in budget builds given its price. Moving on to the power supply, I went with the EVGA 500W 80+ bronze certified power supply. This PSU was only $30. I just wanted to include a power supply that would get the job done but was also very cheap. You know, some of the higher end power supplies are like $60 to $65, and in this kind of a budget, you just can't fit that in. But 500 watts is going to be more than enough for this build, especially considering since you're not going to be going for an SLI configuration, the GTX 960 is a reasonably power efficient video card, and the FX 6300 isn't going to use that much power either. So for $30, the EVGA 500 watt power supply was a very good option in this build. Finally, for the case, I went with the NZXT Source 210 White ATX Mid-Tower case. This case is available in white or black, so just pick the color of your preference. They're around the same price. And yeah, again, in a budget build, the case isn't something that you really should be spending a lot of money on. It's really more for aesthetics, especially in this kind of a budget where you're not trying to do anything crazy. And the Source 210 has been one of the standard bearers for budget end cases for a long time now, and it's still good in 2016. So that's gonna wrap up this video, guys. As always, if you liked this video, hit the like button. If you disliked, obviously hit the dislike button. If you have a request for a future video, leave it in the comments section down below, and I will catch you guys in the next one. Peace out.